First question, what do the following people have in common? Malcolm X, Enoch Powell, John Lennon, Bertrand Russell, and Henry Kissinger. What they all have in common is that they were all men who, in their respective and very different ways, defined the 1960s. But they were also people who were debated with, cajoled by Tariq Ali, our guest here today. He's had an amazing life. His perspective is a unique one, particularly for those of us who came of age in the post 9/11 era. I remember as a student hearing him on an anti-Iraq war demonstration. And what struck me was his refreshing lack of even-handedness on the issue and his passionate sort of denunciation of what the US and the UK were about to embark on, and which really, hasn't ended since then, since 2003, really. He's also, I should say, a very fine novelist. And if anyone who hasn't read his books about set in the Islamic world and Islamic history, I advise you to do so because they are terrific. A filmmaker as well, and also a screenwriter. And just recently we learned that there's an as yet unmade film script of the late V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas that Tariq has. So if anyone's here from Netflix, what are you doing? But Tariq, let's just start with your early life. You were born in what was then colonial India, British-ruled India, and partition happened, I think, when you were very young. Do you have any memories of partition, and did it affect you how did it affect you?
No, partition happened when I was just sort of 3.5. And so my memories of it are non-existent, largely, I think, because my family itself didn't face any traumas. We weren't refugees from one part of India to the other. I mean, the partition of the Indian subcontinent was a horrific event. Nearly 2 million people died in 1947. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, killing each other as the country was divided. But we lived in a part of India which became part of Pakistan. And my family, the bulk of it, wasn't affected. Older cousins recall traveling from their schools in Simla, etc., on trains alone, and their parents not knowing where they were, but no one died, fortunately, which can't be said for many, many other people, rich and poor, mainly the poor who suffered.
Did it have to happen, do you think, partition? Or?
Well, I think at that time, till 1946, apart from the Congress, the other parties were prepared for some sort of compromise, which was to keep India united, but to give maximum autonomy to many of its regions, and see how it went for another 4 or 5 years. That plan was never put into practice, and this hurried, rushed partition led to many deaths and killings. I think it could have been avoided, but then, when you say that to people today, they say, well, look at the state of India, how the minorities are being treated. We were probably right to do it. But that's, sort of being wise after the event. I mean, maybe these things wouldn't have happened had there been no partition, but the debate goes on.
Your family were politically active. They had a radical history to them. Did you sort of imbibe their ideas about, social justice from an early age?
Well, my family, you mean my parents, they were very radical. The family as a whole was deeply reactionary, I have to confess. Very nice people, but politically completely on the other side, and have remained ever since. But I was lucky in terms of my parents, who were very radical, and yes, they had a big influence on me, and not just them, but the whole social milieu of painters and artists and poets and trade union leaders and peasant leaders going through our house. That had a big impact on one, and they were just more interesting people than the family at large.
As you relate in your memoir, Street Fighting Years, you go to Oxford, and is that really when you start reading the text that start to influence
Well, I
your life?
reread some of the texts, the books by Marx and Lenin, etc., in Pakistan. They were available, though some of them were clandestine literature. But in Oxford, I got the libraries and availability of books which were never available in Pakistan, especially, it has to be said, critiques of religion. And so for me, Oxford was very liberating on that level, if not academically. I mean, when I think back on the philosophy we were taught, etc., it was very limited to sort of linguistic and English philosophy. There were no critiques of that available. Spinoza wasn't taught, Nietzsche was barred, etc., etc. So, but on the other hand, the milieu and the other people one met and talked and related to was very important. Yeah.
So just to dig in a bit further to the who would you say, when you were at Oxford in your early time, who was the most influential thinker that you read? Who was the person who really you thought, wow, this is reformulating the way that I'm looking at the world?
Well, I guess that the books which had a huge impact on me, the first was Isaac Deutscher's amazing trilogy, a biography of Trotsky, who's not a thinker I'd read greatly in Pakistan. It's not available. And the Deutscher trilogy had a very big impact on me. Apart from its politics, it's beautifully, exquisitely written. And it's interesting, it made one think that of the two Polish exiles to Britain, Joseph Conrad early on, and Isaac Deutscher later on, their ability to grasp and even transform the English language and the way they wrote was important. And I think it was the combination of reading Isaac Deutscher, which then drove me to read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution and develop a left critique of Stalinism on what passed for socialism or communism in those days. That was extremely important, I think, intellectually for my formation.
At the same time, of course, the Vietnam War was starting and you started to go on demonstrations. How did the sort of ideas that you read in Trotsky inform your sort of activism and your demonstration? Was it you instinctively knew, well, Vietnam War is just wrong, or is it a sort of did you develop a critique that was more sort of
both, but not at the same time? I was very engaged in activism in Pakistan, even under the military dictatorship, where you went on a demonstration and you didn't know how many people were going to be killed on it. I mean, there was one demonstration we were on, and we charged. Our motor scooter guards went through the police lines and they opened fire, and 2 students standing at about that distance were shot dead. So the next day, 100,000 students turned up. It was living on the edge, really, in many, many ways. But we were very active on Vietnam, even as teenagers, following the war. It's the 50s war waged by the French. And interestingly, in the post-colonial world, the Vietnam War had a huge impact. A distant relative of mine, a film director, not at all political, his son was born on the same day as the biggest defeat the French suffered, Dien Bien Phu in 1950. He just named his son Ho Chi Minh. I mean, the poor boy was teased out of his life at school. But he just named him Ho Chi Minh. And when we said, well, why did you do that? He said, what a great victory. And so it's not just people who were politicized, but lots of ordinary people were very inspired by that. And so from that to Britain, I just moved that type of activism with me. And, we used to argue, explain why the war was wrong, etc., etc.
Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister at the time, and I think that your first book was Thoughts of Chairman Harold. Is that right?
That was a book suggested by the then editor of Private Eye, Richard Ingrams, who said that you know so much about what he used to think before he came to power, that why don't you compile his sayings, all the progressive things he said, and we put it out as the Thoughts of Chairman Harold with drawings by Ralph Steadman, very vicious cartoons. Yeah, that was the first little book I wrote.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.